Back in the day, before streaming, before CDs, we listened to music on albums. A vinyl disc spinning 33 and a third revolutions per minute brought us great music one side at a time. 20 or so minutes of music, 4 or 5 songs usually, that created a single listening experience. This format exposed us to other songs of the artist, not just the hits, and often flowed in an order that was created to build and maintain or mold a musical experience for the listener.
Sideshow brings musical experiences from the past to life today. Here, we discuss and review individual sides of record albums we have grown to appreciate and hope you will too. Welcome to The Sideshow.
Welcome to another edition of Sideshow. And today, Mike has pulled one off the shelf. Mike, let's let the audience know what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, I was hesitant on whether or not I should do this because Frank Zappa is not for everyone. But today, we are going to talk about Frank Zappa, Joe's Garage, Act 1, Side 1. Joe's Garage came out in 1979. It was originally released in 2 records. One was Act 1, which was a single album, and then and they might, I don't know this off the top of my head, they may have been released contemporaneously, but the second one, Joe's Garage Acts 2 and 3, was a double LP. So a total of 3 records, 6 sides, and we're going to talk about Act 1, Side 1. And just kind of a little bit of background. It was what came to be known as a rock opera. You know, there was a story and a narrative and characters, and the first album. I've got the album cover here. Shows Frank Zappa with grease on his face and a mop, and it's got a black, it's very straightforward cover. And the second and third acts in the double album was similar cover with Zappa with the black grease on his face, and it had more of a magenta pink on the back than the black. But Joe's Garage Acts 2 and 3, and just to talk about Zappa generally, I mean, he had very prolific artist, put out a lot of records over the course of his career. He died, I believe, at age 54 of was it pancreatic cancer or a type of cancer. It doesn't matter. But I don't necessarily want to get too deep into Zappa's career, but kind of the beginning of his career sort of laid the template for what he ended up doing. In 1966, his first album, which was by the Mothers of Invention, was the name of the band that he was the leader of. And the first album was called Freak Out, which was sort of a euphemism for what was happening in California, in Los Angeles and whatnot, which is where he was from, Los Angeles, California, in the mid-'60s. And people were growing their hair long and starting to sort of break out of the more conformist type culture of the 1950s, and were being more free in their expression, and that was freaking out. It wasn't like a negative term. People talk about freaking out when you have a bad trip after taking acid or something like that, and it wasn't about that. It was more about an individualistic freedom of expression kind of thing, and a lot of satire on his first album. I mean, kind of parodies of sort of 50s music and kind of doo-wop songs. One of the songs, for example, on his first album is "Go Cry on Somebody Else's Shoulder," about someone who's bummed out about just have gotten dumped by their boy or girlfriend and this and that, and also some very avant-garde, kind of aggressive experimental music as well. And and Frank Zappa really had a very misanthropic view of the world. He didn't, he was very down on popular culture, on government, on religion, and conformism. He was, I mean, a very pro individual, and individualism, I think, is one of the themes that always flowed through his music. His second album was called Absolutely Free, also by the Mothers of Invention, and it got a little more caustic in its social commentary, and some of the songs on Absolutely Free were called like Plastic People. Took a very dim view of conformist America. Brown Shoes Don't Make It, which is kind of like about corrupt politics and stuff. And then the last song on that album was America Drinks and Goes Home, which is self-explanatory.
Yes.
And but then the third album came out in 1968, and it was a parody, or intended to be a parody of Sgt. Pepper. And the record company wouldn't let them use the cover that was made for the album. And it was, it had the band standing there, and it said, the mothers in the dirt, but it wasn't flowers. It was like piles of carrots. And Zappa was in a dress. I mean, he was dressed in drag. And his wife is standing next to him, and she's pregnant. So she's got this pregnant belly. And at the time that they were doing this, Jimi Hendrix came to the studio where they were working, and they were going to take this picture. And apparently Zappa said, "Hey, come on, you can get in the pictures." Oh, okay. And so Jimi Hendrix is standing there just because he happened to be in the studio
Well, but
while they
Jimi
were
Hendrix
doing
was
this.
there. Yeah.
But the name of the album was "We're Only in It for the Money," and that was not a real popular take on the Beatles.
Yeah.
Particularly in on the heels of Sgt. Pepper in the Summer of Love and whatnot. And there's some very pointed social commentary on that album. There's a song called "Who Needs the Peace Corps," which was about people coming to San Francisco, and they'd come to San Francisco and they'd hang out with the hippies and they'd take acid. And he took a very dim view of such people. I mean, Zappa he wasn't an anti-drug person, but he never used drugs, and he thought that it interfered with good music making, so he didn't put up with it with the musicians that he played with, at least not while they were either performing or when they were working. And there were other songs on that album. "What's the Ugliest Part of Your Body" was one of the songs, and the answer was "Your Mind." And a song called "Mother People," which was more of a he was sort of a secular humanist of sorts, and so there he's actually kind of putting something more sincere about what he believes out there. But then the last song on that album was called "The Chrome-Plated Megaphone of Destiny," and apparently where that came from was it's somewhere along the line Zappa encountered a blow-up doll, like of a woman, and in between the doll's legs was this metal piece, and it had this thing in it where if you like squeezed the doll, it would make a whistling sound, and that was the chrome-plated megaphone of destiny. So that's where this guy was coming from.
Yeah.
That's where he was coming from.
Well,
and
I think it's when you look at an artist like Frank Zappa, I mean, a question that I ask myself is, how did this guy get so fucking weird? Because it setting aside whether the music is enjoyable or good, or his musical talents and that type of thing. I mean, there's a lot of Frank Zappa that is fucking weird. It's weird to listen to, and again, I don't say that in a way like that means that it's bad, but he certainly has no trouble creating music that where people will think, what was this guy thinking when this came out? And who knew he was? No, he was talking about a rubber doll with
Yeah.
a whistle in their vagina, right? It's but it's kind of interesting. You look back at when he grew up, and his father worked in like he was somehow associated with like the chemical weapons industry. They lived and worked near some, like Aberdeen proving grounds and some like chemical weapons facilities. They had to have protective masks or gas masks in their house because they lived, so closely to these facilities where I guess there was mustard gas and other kind of things. He wrote a song or two that had to do with gas masks as well later on, and that's where that might have come from. But I mean, not I they moved around quite a bit because of the work that the dad did. I don't think he was in the military, but he worked at these military places and moved around quite a bit. Eventually, getting them out to California. But that moving around and the type of work in what was talk about a formal, structured, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this type of lifestyle. Clearly, you can see how some of the notions of wanting to get completely on the other side of things like conformity, norms, politeness, polite society, political correctness. I mean, you can kind of see where that came from originally was rebelling from that side of thing. And the second thing that I see is Frank Zappa was interested in a lot of different types of music, including classical music, and he did some work in classical music as well as the kind of the avant-garde type rock guitar oriented stuff that he did. So there was kind of and not only that, there was a range in types of work that he did. He did a lot of music for film and commercials, including like commercial jingle type work. He did classical music scoring. He did garage band type stuff and recording with and then with this kind of disconnected bouncing around a lot. You can see where there would be a wide hodgepodge of what someone was trying to put together and do that ultimately came out in the Frank Zappa music that came out in his albums, whether it be through the Mothers of Invention or his kind of solo work after that.
The question that you sort of opened up with about how did he get so weird. I think that the answer that if he had survived, if he was still alive, or if he'd ever, and maybe he wasn't afraid to speak to the press, and
No.
you can get YouTube clips of him offering his thoughts on a variety of things. So there's a lot of material out there to go to figure out what he had to say about these things. But I think you talked about it where the area that he was growing up in, the late 50s, very early 60s, before he started working as a musician. Very high conformity period of the relatively recent past,
Mm-hmm.
and the popular culture, the June Cleaver sort of family structure, and religion. He doesn't the Sunday morning churchgoers, whether it be Protestant or Catholic, he clearly perceived all of that as imposing a fairly rigid and restraining force on people, actualizing,
Mm-hmm.
self-actualizing, being themselves, um, and the way he behaves in his mind. Look, if people if just be themselves, stuff comes out, and you don't have to please everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Just don't hurt anybody. And if people don't like my records, they shouldn't buy them. Stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the approach he took. And by the time of the fourth album that Zappa and the Mothers came out with. And things get weird with the order of the albums, because he was doing some things on his own and some
Yeah.
things with his band. But another double album, because Freak Out, his first album was a double album, and this one was called Uncle Meat, and that was just, I mean, it's hard to really figure out what it's about. There was four sides of music. The fourth side was just basically a long jazz, horn, like sax oriented jam. It's pretty instrumental, and the songs that had lyrics were, I mean, it's been a while since I listened to that album, but it's hard to put a finger on what he's talking about or what point they're trying to make, if any.
Yeah.
And then
who says there has to be a point?
Yeah, and then so by this point it's like 1969. We're starting to get close to 1970, and then things get really weird. Not weird, but weird in terms of unclear. He's would continue to work with the Mothers now and again. He did solo stuff. He worked with other musicians. He eventually hooked up with Captain Beefheart and produced some of his music, etc. And he through the 70s started to do things that weren't quite as weird, but but lyrically, I mean, there was always a lot of sexual content in his lyrics. Scatological is a word that's often used to describe his lyrics, and while I don't think that in his life he was demeaning to women, in terms of, he had women in his band. He had a female played like vibraphone and marimba and stuff like that on stage with him. I mean, he was married early on in his career, had children, had two daughters, and I've never heard that he was anything other than a good husband and good father, in his private life, in his personal life. But it's hard not to perceive a lot of his lyrics that are more sexual in nature as being demeaning to women. And that's one of the reasons why it's, why Zappa isn't for everybody. But, the bottom line is, for me, is that as much as any artist in the rock era, Zappa did things his way. And while he was influenced by a lot of different types of music and a lot of different musicians, when he actually got down to working, I mean, he did things his way. And was very skilled at playing guitar, at arranging music, and that was in just like a regular rock band context, or in as far as jazz is concerned, he had a sophisticated understanding of how jazz music was structured and performed. And he understood classical music. I mean, he can write a classical score for an orchestra. He had that ability. So very, very talented person in terms of just music as a thing. And what he chose to use it on was what he felt like. And eventually, in 1979, he came up with Joe's Garage. And Joe's Garage is the story is really kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's just the things that happen to the character of Joe are just kind of ridiculous. But the background is that it's a world where music is being made illegal. And, he had the same kind of targets, the government, religion, popular culture are kind of the targets. And the reason why, music is going to be made illegal is because music is this horrible force, and it drives people to, want to have maniacal sex, to take drugs, to prefer, not working, sticking it to the man. And so, the powers that be are going to get rid of it. And, at the beginning of the album, he's talking about how, as we speak, little men are writing in tiny paragraphs rules with which you break, could lead, if you break them, could lead to the death penalty
Hmm.
or might affect your parents' credit rating and stuff like that. And so in a lot of ways it and there's plenty of sexual encounters in there as well, and it kind of it builds on a lot of the themes that Zappa had addressed earlier in his career, and with the making music illegal, I think was inspired in large part because this was around the time of the Iran Contra, or the not the Iran Contra, but the Iranian hostage crisis.
Hmm.
Because this is pre-Reagan. I mean, this came out in '79, so this is
Yeah.
pre-Reagan. And whereas the Ayatollah had made, listening to rock music was illegal
Hmm.
in Iran, and that's one of the things that
Well,
inspired this.
you also had the first rumblings of record labeling, and that this our children shouldn't be listening to this type of music. And I mean, any parent would listen to a lot of Frank Zappa and say our children should not be listening to this music. It's understandable where they were coming from. And I see, and I think you're absolutely right that Frank Zappa was really focused on doing what he wanted to do, and he clearly encountered a lot of frustration and roadblocks in doing that. And it wasn't always the man. I feel that one of the reasons that he struggled to do a lot of things was because he was trying to do so much. I mean, this notion of scoring classical pieces and doing film scores and doing commercial jingles and trying to get things right with the mothers and doing his own solo. This was all happening at the same time. He was trying to do all of these things. And early on in his career, he ended up having to move into the studio that they were using, and then they ended up getting kicked out of that because they couldn't pay their rent. There's a lot of frustrations along the way, and I truly believe, like a lot of things, that if Zappa would have focused, say, on his album-oriented rock, he would have. Now he might have come out with the exact same music, but he wouldn't have had the same level of frustration. And that frustration did, though, come through frustration with the government, frustration with the system, frustration with music companies, frustration, that definitely played itself out and probably had a lot to do with, I'm going to do the exact opposite of what a lot of people think I should do. This is what a hit sounds like on a radio. I am not going to do that. I'm going to do something that no one would ever play on the radio. And it wasn't like he didn't understand. If he needed to communicate and wanted people to listen to him, he knew how to do it. When he was on CNN arguing against the censorship of lyrics and labeling and that type of stuff, he wore a suit, right? And he looked pretty good in it. As a matter of fact, and he understood, if I'm going to get my message across to these people, this is a way that I have to do it. So it wasn't as if he was, he was very intentional in putting his music down this way. As weird as we can laugh about how weird this was or whatever, but he was doing what he wanted to do. I would 100% agree.
But I mean, he was definitely, one thing he wasn't was dumb. The guy,
Yeah.
he was an intelligent guy, and when he felt like it, he could be very intelligent in his presentation. That wasn't his stock in trade, because that just wasn't what he chose to do in terms of
Yeah.
his performing musically. But the guy was smart, and the fact that he was as obnoxious as he was, as often as he was, it rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and there are times where it rubs me the wrong way. But overall, there is a lot of very insightful social commentary in some of his songs. There is a lot of great guitar playing in his music, and there is just very unique arrangements and ways of putting music together that is worth, in my opinion, it's worth people's time. You may have to endure some abrasive or offensive lyrically material. And
Yeah.
if you listen to a lot of his records, there is some uniformity. There's stuff like, oh, this sounds like that, or he
Hmm.
sometimes is kind of rehashing ideas and things that he's used before. But it's the good stuff is worth getting to
Hmm.
and hearing from Frank Zappa, in my opinion.
I,
Um,
I would absolutely agree. And then just, one more thing on that. It's like when you listen to, later on, there was a lot of stuff that came out about just him playing the guitar, and you can hear the skill and the quality and the Zappa sound in the way that he played guitar, which is, it's unique. It's his own style, but it's very good, right? And it's when you're listening to that, that was certainly a part of it. And I mean, clearly there was some influence there to try to turn some of the stuff into this more avant-garde. I mean, you mentioned Captain Beefheart. I mean, I'd never heard of Captain Beefheart before I went into the service. We used to listen to Zappa in high school. Part of that, the young boy, he said poop, kind of thing was definitely a draw in initial listenings to Frank Zappa before you really started to listen to it. It's like, oh yeah, listen to what this guy talks about. But then as you begin to listen to the music and that style, and when I was in the service, this my buddy in the service, Tom Adams, had this Trout Mask Replica, which was a Captain Beefheart album, and I'm listening to that, and it's like, yeah, there's like some Zappa sound to this. Actually, Captain Beefheart and Frank Zappa went to high school together. I don't know I don't Van Vliet or something like that was Captain Beefheart's real name.
Don Van Vliet was
Yes,
his
they,
name.
they went to the same high school they knew each other in high school. So maybe there was something in the water in that high school, or maybe it was working together that they did. But they definitely felt that there was a niche for this avant-garde type stuff, and the fact that we're still talking about him today shows that there absolutely was.
Well, and uh, Trout Mask Replica, which Zappa produced
Hmm.
by Captain Beefheart, you listen to that, and it makes most Frank Zappa music sound very normal.
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
that
it
is.
makes Frank Zappa sound like ABBA.
I mean, Trout
Yeah.
Mask Replica is disturbingly strange music. I mean, it's worthwhile. I mean, if someone's into music, they should check it out at least once. But it's to the left of Zappa
Oh yeah.
by a long shot. In any case, Joe's Garage,
Let's
the
dive in.
side Act One, Side One, it starts out with a track called "The Central Scrutinizer," and the Central Scrutinizer is actually a character in the story, and it's either a government official of some kind, or it's probably more like a kind of what we now think of as like an AI generated
Yes.
voice
An
that
avatar.
and is talking about and the central scrutinizer's job is to enforce all the laws that haven't been passed yet, and is talking about the what's happening in the world, and that the powers that be need to do something to get a handle on what's happening, and these young people are committing crimes before we can get laws passed to deal with them, and the central scrutinizer says, and many of these people were driven to do these crimes by a horrible force called music.
Music.
Music uh and sort of like music is the enemy of the people, and we have to get down on this, and it's sort of like the great Satan that's been identified by the powers that be that we need to squelch, so that the boys and girls will grow up compliant and go off and get jobs in the factories, and
Hmm.
blah 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 blah, and and then he introduces you. We bring you now a special presentation to illustrate what will happen to you if you choose a career in music. So this the first track, and there's music. It's not just a narration, but it's not a song in the conventional sense with lyrics and verses. It's basically a musical accompaniment to the central scrutinizer, sort of setting the table for the story.
And that the central scrutinizer, who really becomes basically a narrator to the entire story that takes us all the way through all of the acts of this. It's the listening to the voice and the way that it's done. It's an interesting way of doing it, and really does a good job of timing and pace to talk about how it's music. That ends up being the. But I also like the way that the reason that they're doing this is to make room for the future. That's why all these laws need to be written and everything. We've got a kind of like the new golden age that we need to we need to have. It's important that we get all these laws, and that we get rid of this evil of music, because we have to make room for the future.
When he even says, the laws are being addressed, and even the Constitution, which itself is being modified to accommodate the future.
Yes.
I mean, and given, some things that are going on right now in terms of constitutional interpretation, in the reality TV sense, it's really it was very prescient of some of those things.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, the central scrutinizer, and you're absolutely right. Basically, the central scrutinizer reappears in between most of the songs all the way through the entire thing, and is one of the devices that Zappa used to kind of make the story flow and kind of get you up to date of what's going on before the next song starts. And the next song on side one, which is really the first song of the rock opera. It's called Joe's Garage, and it starts out, we would jam in Joe's garage. I mean, so it's Joe and his buddies. They were a garage band. They were playing simple rock music in the garage, and it's almost that simple. We could jam in Joe's garage. His mama was screaming, "Turn it down." We were playing the same old song, and sometimes we would play it all night long.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, a very, very simple sentiment. And, at one point he's like, down in Joe's garage, we didn't have no dope or LSD, but a couple of quarts of beer would make it so the intonation would wrap up in our ears, and the same old chords going over and over became a symphony. And I've had the experience, earlier in my life to actually play in a band with guys, to be in a band. And I played bass guitar, and my ability was very rudimentary, but I did have enough of a feel for music that I could kind of fill the pocket with a drummer and do what needed to be done. But listening to yourself, it always sounds good. It's when you're doing it. Now, if you listen to yourself you record yourself and then you listen to it, it's like, Jesus Christ, this sounds like shit. But when you're playing it, it sounds good.
Especially when you play it, as they talk about in this song, over and over, one more time. And it's like we might be getting better at this, right? This particular song. But you hear kind of the, hanging in Joe's garage, playing in Joe's garage, explaining how they, were crowded in. The drums kit was backed by the Dodge, in the garage, and the parents didn't necessarily like it, but they let them jam there, and they couldn't do much, but what they could do, they were trying to make it. But you get a feel like, this is a band. It certainly didn't make you want to join a local garage band. It made it sound, yeah, let's do this. We'll have a couple of quarts of beer, and we'll get better.
But about this time we were getting the eye from the girls in the neighborhood.
Yep, yep.
They came on over and danced around, and then and so we had some cards printed up for a couple of bucks, and we were on our way to fame. And a guy from a company we can't name said we ought to take his pen and sign on the line for a real good time, but he wouldn't tell us when. These good times would be something that was really happening. So the band broke up. I mean, it just sort of like, yeah, this was a fucking pipe dream.
Yeah.
But it's a good timey sound and song, and it doesn't have that sort of jaundiced, critique of the way things are that is is a lot of Zappa. And there's some, at the very end, there's some lyrical references to how music changed, and glitter rock and snotty boys with lipstick on, where they were sort of lamenting, the good old days of just the good old garage rock, playing Little Richard or whatever.
And some of the positive aspects of that, you playing in a band, you get the eye of the girls, which they kind of turn on that theme a little later in this side. But we'll, but the notion of, no, this was fun, and the girls would come and dance, and there was the idea of playing in the garage is great. Where it started to get bad, and you listen to this song, where it started to get bad was when you started to get like money involved. The record company gets involved, and suddenly, they're promising all this stuff, and won't this be great? But it never comes, and the band ends up breaking up, probably all hating each other, and that type of thing. And couldn't we just have stayed in the garage with the girls from the neighborhood dancing at the end of the driveway? Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I'm remembering this right, but I believe that Bruce Springsteen signed a contract like on the hood of a car in the parking lot outside a club he was playing at. And he ended up, it took him, the reason why there was so much time between Born to Run and Darkness on the Edge of Town was because he was extracting himself from a lousy contract that he'd signed under whatever the circumstances were. And so it was real commentary along the lines of what you're talking about. But in any case, to move on with what's happening on the side, at the end of the song, the neighbor lady calls the police, and the police come and break up the jam session, and that was, the central scrutinizer comes in and says that was Joe's first encounter with the law. And the officer told him that he should stick closer to church-oriented activities. Which brings us to the next track on the album, Catholic Girls. Now, before we talk about this, I should note that my Teresa, my high school girlfriend, and my wife are both Catholic girls, and these are the two most substantial, intimate relationships I've had with women in my life, and the only arguable flaw, to either of these women is their taste in men. So just before we talk about this song, I just want to get that out there. But Catholic Girls is about Catholic girls, and the sentiment behind this song is sort of like a real world unmasking of like the girl in Billy Joel's Only the Good Die Young, who was sort of like, hey, come on, you Catholic girls start much too late, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. It's like, well, that's great, whereas Zappa's take on Catholic girls was that the sort of the sexually repressive way in which they were raised caused a phenomenon to occur when they got to be a certain age where they rebelled and became extremely sexually active. And while I don't, in my own experience, that wasn't necessarily what I found about Catholic girls. But I imagine there's some truth to that, at least in Zappa's experience. But it's a relatively a relatively extreme take on the sexual habits of Catholic girls, but it's done in a more of an affectionate way than an insulting way, in my humble opinion. I have never played the song for my wife, and normally, I mean, I would have imagined, my wife and I have a son, and I would have imagined at some point that, when he gets to be that age, I'll have to play Catholic girls for him. Well, I didn't do that.
Yeah.
Because his mother and his sister were Catholic girls.
Well, I'd agree that although the song, I mean, that's kind of the theme or the focus of the song, but it's a little more playful in that there's kind of some exchanges back and forth where at one point they're listing off some specific Catholic girls, and then you hear some Catholic girls listing off some Catholic boys, and kind of this kind of back and forth, and I really, I see it as more of kind of an entertaining kind of glimpse into this than some type of raw savagery of Catholic girls.
Yeah, no, it is more of kind of like fondly remembering the innocence of youth and the revelations that occur, as you realize that the girl that you thought you might ask to dance a slow song, turns out that she's got much more experience with one of the football players than you'd ever imagined. Is kind of one, more of the vibe than anything else. But one, I mean, and the last verse of the song, it's like Catholic girls in the little white dress. Catholic girls, they never confess. Catholic girls, I've got one for a cousin. I love how they go, so send me a dozen. And depending on how you take that, I take it as kind of a nod of the hat to the fond memories that Zappa had of Catholic girl, or that he imagined. I bet that Zappa didn't hang out with that many Catholic girls when he was growing up. But
it also, this song is kind of a good example of a lot of the songs on this set of three parts of this, where you've got this music that's being intermingled with some talking and narration, with some sound effects. And that type of thing, along with the song itself. We're moving out of the notion of verse chorus solo verse chorus. This is you're starting to get into some different types of things, and again this mixing in of completely unrelated sound effects and speaking and narration and that type of thing, along with just the theme of the music, which again you got to get used to if you're going to listen to any Zappa.
Well, and the music in the song Catholic Girls, there are times where it's kind of a combination of like a lounge act with some sort of music hall, organ arrangement. And then there's times where it's kind of a disco-fied form of like jazz rock fusion. And one thing to say, I mean, at this point, all of Joe's Garage, it's very well produced, very well recorded music. The sound quality, I mean, and this was in the late 70s. This was pre-compact disc, pre-Blu-ray disc, and not unlike, say, like Pink Floyd in the 70s. Very close attention paid to the production of the music, and and or like Steely Dan and stuff like that. I mean,
Yes.
just very very carefully produced music in terms of the sound and the quality of the sound.
Well, and I mean, and a lot of that breaks from, I mean, Frank Zappa had access to some of the earliest multi-track recording, equipment out in California, and he really focused on understanding how to use it, and the things that you could do where you don't just have a right and a left side, which for a lot of music that was coming out at that time, I mean, that was the leading edge of being able to do good stereo. And then the ability, though, to have 5, 8 tracks. And Zappa very quickly latched onto that and really wanted to kind of immerse himself in the ability, which you get some very complex yet well done productions that come along with these Zappa albums.
On Zappa's second album, Absolutely Free, in 1967, one of the band members named Don Preston kind of had like a homemade synthesizer, and it was one of the first times that's like a synthesizer as we know it to be now was used on a recording that was put out. But in any case, the final track on the album comes after Catholic Girls, and the Central Scrutinizer comes back in, and Joe had met a girl. He had a girlfriend named Mary, who he met at the CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization, and he talks, I mean, somewhat sarcastically. The Sentinel Scrutinizer is laying this out somewhat sarcastically when he says, Joe and Mary would meet and go to the church club. They would sit together, hold hands, and think pure thoughts. But one night, Mary didn't show up, and the Central Scrutinizer goes on to say that Mary was he uses different language to describe it, but basically she was on her knees, coaxing her way backstage at a rock concert. And the last track on the side is called Crew Slut, which was a form of groupie, and I think kind of like the entry level groupie. And whereas the groupie, the Kate Hudson character from Almost Famous, she's with the rock stars. Well, the Crew Sluts were with the roadies, and it's kind of a straightforward blues song is the way the music is arranged. And the opening verse of Crew Slut is one of my favorite set of lyrics, certainly of Zappa and maybe of anybody. But it's talk. Okay, there's this rock band and they're traveling around and they do a concert in Los Angeles where Joe and Mary live. Actually, the Canoga Park neighborhood of Los Angeles is where they live, and so talking about the traveling rock band, the song starts out, "Hey, hey, hey, all you girls in these industrial towns. I suppose you're probably getting tired of all the local clowns. They never give you no respect. They never treat you nice. So perhaps you ought to take a little friendly advice and be a crew slut."
Yeah.
Now that you kind of at the end, it's okay, but right up to that point, it's like yeah, you're right, and and having been one of the local clowns myself earlier in life, I didn't necessarily it wasn't a flattering portrayal, but not that it wasn't accurate about the what would provoke a teenage girl to run away from home and go on the road with a rock band.
Well, and I think that's one of the things. I mean, when you first, the title of the song and the way you lead into the song, you can understand how, again, first glance, someone, especially from a more prudish time period, would be like, well, why do you have to say that? Why can't you just play music? And well, again, Frank Zappa lived in this industry. This was his life. Frank Zappa knew that was a reality in that industry. This. I mean, there's no use kind of covering this up. There was not only was there a push from the side of fans, from girls, from local girls to get backstage. There was a very orchestrated effort from the band to get girls backstage. I mean, this happened. I was at a concert with my ex-wife Maureen, and she was tapped on the shoulder while we're watching the concert, and a guy gives her a backstage pass and says, "Come around after the show." We were watching. It was a Gary Moore concert in Germany, right where we were at, and she, we were with some friends. Like, yeah, go. Well, I mean, it was very clear when she got back there. They did. She signed a thing or two, but it's like, hey, we're all going back to the hotel, right? This is the band. This was the people back there, and they had something in mind when they were tapping these girls on the show. They were looking for the attractive girls, a particular age, out in the crowd. So, Frank Zappa, it's like, look, this kind of the crew slut, the notion that women are being used like this, and women are wanting to be used like this, to get access, to get, to meet someone famous, to get backstage, whatever it is. I mean, it's a reality. This is the business we have chosen. And this is a reality of this. So I don't see what the big deal about me just singing a song about it, right? Yeah. Billy Joel singing a song about, two people falling in love, and that happens, right? He's singing a song about how, it starts to smell like beer when you're playing piano in a bar, and that's fine. Well, guess what? This other stuff happens too. And, yeah. I'm just going to sing about it the way it is. So, but it's a pretty crude introduction to the song and a pretty crude topic. He certainly doesn't try to water it down, especially the central scrutinizer introducing what is going on here. So, but on the same token, it's like you can. You can say, look, if you tone this stuff down a little bit, you might have a little broader audience. But at the same time, he's like, this is happening in my back door every time I go on the road. So let's write a song about it.
When and I have not seen it yet, but there's the new Becoming Led Zeppelin, the new movie that's out. I have not seen it yet. I intend to see it, but I have a funny feeling that they left the the mud shark incident from the Edgewater Hotel in Seattle out of that movie.
I did see the movie, and nothing discussed in the movie whatsoever about things that were happening from the moment that the concert ended, be it with groupies, fans, local prostitutes, or people that happen to be making their way through the hotel.
Well, and
conveniently left out from the story.
And anyone who's immersed themselves in Led Zeppelin over the years, as you and I have, knows that stuff was going on.
Yes.
But in any case, the one of the things about a Cruise Slut is that, as I said, it's a fairly straightforward blues song in terms of the musical arrangement, and up to this point, there hasn't been a conventional guitar solo or instrumental break.
Yeah.
In any of the songs up to this point. The Central Scrutinizer was sort of not really a song, but more of an intro to the whole story. Joe's Garage didn't have a guitar solo in it, and nor did Catholic Girls or any other instrumental break. But in Cruise Slut, there's a fantastic break, and it's not your typical guitar solo, but it's very down and dirty, and then a harmonica comes in at the end. It's more of a conventional harmonica solo, but I mean, I think that is just very unique, and in Zappa, because it's not I'll before we conclude, I'll talk about briefly what happens for the rest of the story after side one, but it's the break sounds like if in 1962, Slim Harpo had showed up at the Dexter Lake Club unannounced and got on stage and started jamming.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's got a real down and dirty, bluesy, raucous feel that's unlike anything else on Joe's Garage,
Yeah.
and is the sort of thing that makes you forget. Oh yeah, I'm listening to a Frank Zappa song.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least I thought so, or I think so when I hear that part of the song.
And that's what there are those across. We've talked. It's different, and some of it's unusual and whatever. But you are going to get these moments of just what is interesting, different, but good music that comes along with with these songs. You might have to wait a little bit for it, depending on what you're doing, but it's gonna be there. It's gonna be there.
And it's the kind of music that people who are turned off, not without justification,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times, but who are turned off by Zappa's lyrical content, are the sort of people that would really like some of these
Yeah.
purely musical aspects of his playing.
Mm-hmm.
And the guitar break in Cruise Lot is one of those examples. But so Mary, as far as the story is concerned, Mary ends up getting on the bus with the rock group and leaves town, and that's basically how the song ends. And there's an outro by the Central Scrutinizer to kind of get you caught up, and that
Mm-hmm.
brings an end to the side. And before we conclude here, just to briefly describe the rest of what happens in the story, and also there is a technique that doesn't appear on side one, and it actually doesn't appear on the final side, what would be the side 6
Mm-hmm.
of the story. But there's a technique, and I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. It starts with an X. It's either xenochrony or xenechrony. There's a term, a musical term, where you take a piece of music that had previously been recorded and use it as a basis, or combine it with an unrelated piece of music. And Zappa did this with guitar solos that he had recorded from previous live performances in various locations, and would use it as the basis for creating a new song. And then this old guitar solo that had been played in a different context would be the guitar solo in the song.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that's interesting of note. But in any case, after Mary gets on the bus, she ends up with the rock group in Miami, and she has grown weary of being a mattress for the roadies in this rock band, and so she doesn't have any money to get a bus ticket back home, like on a Greyhound or whatever. So she goes to a wet T-shirt contest and wins, and that is an amusing
Mm-hmm.
part, one of the more lighthearted parts of the album. And she ends up winning the contest and gets the money to go back home. But Joe's been back home this whole time, and he's disillusioned because Mary just sort of upped and disappeared, and so he's kind of down on things. And he meets a woman named Lucille who works at a Jack in the Box, fast food place, and she's not as pure as Mary in some ways, so she screws up Joe's head. There's a song called "Lucille Has Messed Up My Mind,"
Mm-hmm.
and he also catches gonorrhea. He gets the clap from Lucille. And there's another song that comes out of that, which, if you use your imagination, you can figure out what that song is. So now Joe is even more disillusioned with the female companionship that he's had in his life up to this point. He's sort of a down on his luck teenage, guy who's going out into the world, and he ends up meeting a guy named L. Ron Hoover, who is patterned after L. Ron Hubbard
Mm-hmm.
from Scientology, and then the J. Edgar Hoover, sort of the government is starting to get involved here as well. And so Joe joins the First Church of Appliantology, And the philosophy of this church is that the only way to achieve true sexual gratification is through the use of machines. And so Joe ends up going to this like disco bar called The Closet, where he meets a robot whose name is Cyborg, and they dance together at the club, and then they end up going back to one of their apartments for a relatively sordid encounter. And this robot, this isn't like Westworld.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the robot is described as a cross between a vacuum cleaner and a chrome piggy bank. So it's and so they go back. They have they have this liaison that is explicitly described in the song. I'll leave it to your imagination, or go check it out.
They'll tell you.
But in his enthusiasm, Joe ends up breaking Cyborg, because he was a little rough in his handling of Cyborg, and so the cops come, and he's arrested for destroying this someone else's property, and he's taken to prison. Well, now music has recently been made illegal while all this is going on, and so he ends up in prison with all these former music executives. There's been this sort of lawfare against the music industry, and so he's in prison with these music executives, and he's at the low end of the totem pole at the prison. And again, I'll leave it to everyone's imagination as to what that means. And there are a number of songs which describe the activity that Joe is subjected to by these other inmates in prison, and it eventually kind of starts to drive him crazy. And so to get away from what has been done to him by these other inmates, the music executives in prison, he decides to become sullen and withdrawn and dream of guitar playing. And so he spends his time laying on the cot in the prison, imagining guitar solos in his mind. And he can't wait to see what life is like on the outside. And eventually he's released from the prison, and the world has changed. And it's all computer goods and whatnot, and consumer goods is what I meant to say. That have been used and discarded, and it's kind of a very dystopian, grim take on things. And he's basically gone insane while he was in prison, and he starts to think about the neighbor that called the cops on the band back in the garage, and she's like, he used to cut my grass. He was a very nice boy. But that the whole thing is an illustration of the horrible things that happen to you when you get involved in music. Mm-hmm. And then he's so crazy, he starts imagining music reviews for his imaginary solos. And there's a song about the music journalism, and a lot of one of the first times I ever heard synthetic percussion was on Joe's Garage. In addition to these xenochronic, and I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but in addition to these guitar solos, lot of synthetic percussion in parts of these songs, which is very interesting. Or at least it was interesting at the time. It's probably not as interesting now, all these years later. But I recall that was something that I had not heard in music up to this point. In any case, Joe comes to realize that he starts to have some insight into his insanity, and he realizes he's got to move on, and after kind of a moment of clarity of sorts, he dreams his last imaginary guitar solo, and there's like a 10-minute track, and it's just a guitar solo by Zappa, and it doesn't use this technique It's one that he recorded specifically for the album. It's called Watermelon and Easter Hay, and it's just a fantastic guitar solo. And Zappa regarded it as the best track on the whole thing. And his son Dweezil, who is a guitar player, said that it was the best guitar solo his father ever played. And so here's someone who, with a intense love of his father and his father's music, identified that. And then the last song, and then the song ends because Joe gets a good job at the Utility Muffin Research Kitchen, and his job is to take like he squirts a thing of frosting on each muffin as it comes by on the belt, and he's a happy guy now because he found a good job. And then Zappa sings the last song, and it's got one of his best lyrics, in my opinion, to kind of close this whole thing up, to end the story and the song. They're playing, and he says, they're pretty good musicians, but it don't make no difference if they're good musicians, because anybody who would buy this record doesn't give a fuck if there's good musicians on it, because this is a stupid song, and that's the way I like it.
Kind of summing up a lot of the stuff that we've talked about
kind of sums it up. So that is Joe's Garage, and side one of Act One is I think one of the better parts of it. It's not for the faint of heart or the easily offended, but someone with an adventurous musical spirit owes it to themselves to check out Joe's Garage by Frank Zappa.